Hi, welcome to our event today called Enhancing Environmental Stewardship and Policy Development through Indigenous Science. I'm Dr. Jordan Holman. I'm going to be your moderator today. I'm an environmental assessment officer in the Environmental Protection Branch of Environment and Climate Change Canada. And before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from Ottawa, which is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And I encourage you to take a moment, wherever it is that you are, to acknowledge the traditional territories, traditional Indigenous territories of wherever it is that you're watching this. So I'm very excited to introduce our guest for today, Dr. Myrle Ballard. Dr. Ballard is a Canada Research Chair and Associate Professor in the Faculty of Science at the University of Calgary. She works in the Department of Earth, Energy, and the Environment. She's an Anishinaabe scholar from Lake St. Martin First Nation, and she holds her doctorate in natural resources and environmental management. So she's trained both in Western science and Indigenous science, and is just sort of the perfect person to help us bridge this gap. Her research focuses on Indigenous science, particularly the environmental knowledge and ecological understanding embedded in Indigenous ways of knowing. From 2022 to 2024, Dr. Ballard served as the first Director of Indigenous Science Division at Environment and Climate Change Canada. In this role, she was really responsible for the establishment of the Government of Canada's first permanent Indigenous Science Division, advancing the inclusion of Indigenous science in environmental policy and in decision-making. And this initiative aligns with Canada's commitment to reconciliation and responds to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's call to integrate Indigenous knowledge systems within government and in academia. Dr. Ballard's research includes documenting the impacts of flooding and emergency response efforts in her home community of Lake St. Martin First Nation and the surrounding areas. She also explores the use of Anishinaabe-Moan as a baseline for monitoring ecosystem changes, analyzing how the original names of places and natural features can reflect environmental indicators. And so with that, it's an honor to have you here, Dr. Ballard.
Yes, thank you for inviting me. And this afternoon I'm going to be talking about the work that I do, mainly 3-eyed seeing, Anishinaabe stewardship, laws, and biodiversity monitoring using 3-eyed seeing. So I'm going to be doing a presentation, but I'm not going to be the only one who's going to be talking. During the presentation, you'll be asking me questions, and as each slide appears, if you're interested, interject. So the talk today is about my research that I'm doing at 3-eyed seeing, and specifically it's about our relations, Indigenous science and Western science, and within the Indigenous science we have the Anishinaabe stewardship laws, which I'm going to go into more detail. Indigenous science is very specific. It's different from Indigenous knowledge systems. If you're going to say Indigenous knowledge systems, you have to say Western knowledge systems, because we're always comparing the two sciences and working with them, Indigenous science, Western science. And it's different from traditional knowledge as well. They're not the same thing. So they're very different. And Indigenous science is about the knowledge held by Indigenous peoples since time immemorial. It's real-time science. It's constantly changing. It's not static. It's constantly evolving. Indigenous science know about the lands, about the waters, because it's real-time events are taking place, real-time activities. And Indigenous science are the first responders of the land, meaning, say for example, take an ambulance. When there's an accident, something is wrong, they are the first responders to the accident, and because of Indigenous peoples' close connection with the lands and waters, they know what's happening on the land. They are the first responders, and they bring this knowledge forward so that we can all act upon it.
Yeah, and I think something that's interesting here that I want to bring up that you talked about is Indigenous science isn't just this old knowledge, this historical knowledge. When you talk about, it's almost like a living thing. And when I try to look at that from the perspective of Western science, Western science is really built in the scientific method in this. You have observations and hypotheses, and then you build. And, when I hear you talk about this, it sounds like Indigenous science is also built on observations, repeated multiple observations. Is that fair?
Yeah. Yes, that's fair, because Indigenous science is the knowledge of the land, and it's on the observations, repeated observations. They know when things are good, and they know when things are wrong. So that's when the repeated observations, that's the same, like the same method as Western science, but it's a little bit different. And as well too, Indigenous science is both about qualitative, quantitative, because you use both of these systems when you determine what the science is with Indigenous science. For example, when Indigenous peoples make medicine, it's a quantitative, but that's the same thing as going into a laboratory during experiments. You do a quantitative analysis, and this is the same as Indigenous science. Indigenous science know that you can't take medicines for plants for medicines from a contaminated area. It has to be far away from places where there's no contamination. And it involves a specific, like when you take the census, for example, you have the plants need to feel a certain way. There's touch, they have to taste a certain way, they have to smell a certain way, and as well too, like listening to what's out there, and those are all quantitative. And when you make medicines, you have to keep adjusting to the color of the medicine that you're making, and the medicines need to be picked. They have to be picked at a certain time. You can't just go pick medicines whenever you feel like it. They have to look a certain way, and there's protocols involved with picking plants, medicinal plants, for example. And the changes in the water too, like Indigenous people know when there's changes in the water, because the association of certain insects, plants with the water, when a horse drinks from the water, that means that the water is good. When a horse doesn't drink from the water, and the other wild animals, for example, when they know when the water is good.
Yeah, and I'm curious hearing that, like, it's really interesting that there's also this strong quantitative piece with Indigenous science. And I'm curious, like, when establishing Indigenous science, is it also similar in Western science that there's sort of an iterative process to learning over time, like one piece builds onto the next, and then you learn as you see, what works, or how do you build sort of as a living thing?
Yeah, it's built over time. For example, water. Let's talk about water. And Indigenous people's knowledge of water, the knowledge they built on the knowledge over time. It's an iterative process, because they know what the water was like. For example, Anishinaabemowin, the words that are used are specific place names. They know about the water, the naming of places of certain points around the watershed, around the ecosystem. They were named specific to their role in the ecosystem. So the process changes, the iterative process, where the knowledge built upon each other, but at the same time, they know this is where the difference becomes important. They know the original names of the spaces and places, like around water, because they're the ones who live in the area, who use the area, versus a Western scientist who just parachutes to an area, is just there for a certain time and leaves. And it might be a different scientist who's there next time, but for Indigenous peoples, it's always the same, and the knowledge is built upon each other, and they know the changes that are occurring since original naming through the oral history, the oral tradition, and the real-time events that are taking place.
Yeah, that's such an interesting way to think about it because, you know, like as, let's say a Western scientist, if you come to me and say, oh, this is Indigenous science and oh, the name of this place tells me about it, and you might think, well, that's not data-driven or that's not science-driven, but I think what's important and what I'm hearing to understand is it's a different way of being, and it's a different like cultural way of passing down knowledge. And just because names mean one thing, you know, to Western or settler culture, the name was almost a part of that scientific process. That was sort of how the knowledge was locked in and passed down, and it doesn't mean was never quantitative, and it doesn't mean any of those things that, you know, we don't associate it with normal science. That's just part of the culture and how it got passed. That's really interesting.
Yeah. So the knowledge is not ancient. It's constantly evolving, and it's based on real-time events, real-time changes. So the important thing is with the three-eyed seeing framework is our relations, which means our relations is everything that's out there besides humans. For example, the lands, the waters, all the species, flora and fauna, and those are our relations. And Indigenous peoples know that we live with our relations, and we are responsible for them. Our relations, because of Indigenous people's close connection with the land, and like I said, they are the first responders of something that's happening on the lands, waters, to species. Indigenous peoples will be the voice for our relations. And it's important to listen to our relations, what they have to say, because their voice matters. We have to learn to listen to what the water is saying, because as scientists, we're always making decisions for the water. We're always making decisions for the land. We're always making decisions for the species. And do we ever stop to ask them what they want? What is it that they want? And this is what our relations is to the three-eyed seeing is stopping, learning to listen to the land, learning to listen to the water, exactly what is it that the water is telling us. And we have to listen to what is wrong with the water.
Yeah, and I really love this three-eye seeing piece in your research because, and you can help me make sure I'm understanding this correctly, but the most common model for Indigenous science was something that I've heard it told to me called two-eyed seeing, where you have the Western science perspective and you have the Indigenous science perspective, and you're trying to weave those together. And you can help me here. Your three-eyed seeing piece, that's bringing in a third piece, which is that knowledge of the land and the voice of the land itself. Is that right? So like, yeah, and that's just so interesting to me because, you know, we often, I think, and I don't know if this is a Western culture thing or just how we are as people, but we sometimes look at like, what do we need? What do we need from the land? What do we need to get? What do we want the water to be like? And we don't really think, what does the land want? What does the land need? And is that a good understanding or of where you're going with the three-eyed seeing?
I think you're getting it. So
getting there, making a little progress.
We're making progress here. So I think it's very important to understand. For example, growing up, and my mother was the one that taught me about what is around me, telling me about the way the leaves sound, the way the trees, when it's windy, the sound of the leaves, the sound of rain coming. These are the indicators. And when land is destroyed, for example, the research that I've done was about flooding, man-made floods, anthropogenic, and from the changes in what used to be a sustainable livelihoods in the community to one that was where the land was completely destroyed, decimated by the flood, and observing changes in the landscape, the vegetation, and what are the indicators of these changes. And this is where Indigenous people's knowledge of the land is really important, because they're the ones who live there. They know what these changes are. If frogs live close to water, back and forth, that's their habitat. Indigenous peoples know that when there's no frogs, that they don't hear the sound of frogs, which is a common occurrence when you live in the country, like springtime, you hear frogs. And when I talked to the elders doing my research, they said they named a lot of these what the indicators are of change. When there's no frogs, when you don't hear frogs anymore, that means that something is wrong with the land. And they named birds too that disappeared because of flooding. And the change in the landscape, like if a Western scientist came to Lake St. Martin and there's no water, the report that would be taken back is that there's no water. But what the Western scientists fails to capture is the history of the changes that are on the land. The Western scientist was not there when there is a flood, which destroyed livelihoods of the people or displaced these little animals. So it's important to have, to know, to be there with the experiential aspect of the knowledge. You have to live it.
Yeah, and I'm hearing it's interesting. You had talked earlier about Indigenous science being sort of a living thing, and maybe some of the Indigenous knowledge, the history is almost like baseline conditions. I'm framing this in my own Western sciencey way, right? I think, okay, you have your baseline conditions, and then you talk about like the sound of the frogs or different things, and that's like it's an indicator, and it might be different from Western science where we say, okay, if we're looking for an indicator in the water, we measure this exact parameter in the water, we measure that exact parameter in the water. But when you bring in that third eye and the land speaking, the frogs are experiencing the change in the water. They know the water's changed. And if it makes them act differently, it's just I'm framing this in my own Western way, that it doesn't, there's totally normal like Western science processes feeding all of this, but it's so complex. But the frog is doing the complexity for you. It's feeling the land, and it knows something's changed, and it's telling you. Is that a fair analogy? Me trying to translate this into Western science for myself a little bit?
Yeah, that's a fair analogy. And from there on, that's why it's a three-edged seeing, because you have to use all three lenses: the lens of our relations, so the lens of Indigenous science, and the lens of Western science. You have to use all three. Because in order to be more proactive, in order to protect, in order to conserve, you have to use all three of the sciences. The lens of our relations is really critical, because that's the goal all the time, is to, like the work of what ECCC is doing, is a protection the protection and conservation, right? So what it is, what do we want to protect? What do we want to conserve? We want to do things what we think we should do. So the three-eyed, like I said, is being the lens for our relations, asking our relation, what is it they want protection from? What do they want conserved?
Yeah.
Do they want their habitats? Do they want them protected from development, exploration, etc.?
What about the Western science piece of that? What's that eye? How do you weave that in? Is it once you have some indicators and you have the knowledge, then you start going in and maybe looking at specific parameters using Western science, or what does that look like?
Yeah, I'm going to be explaining that.
Oh, I'll let you get to your slide when you explain that then.
For example, this is our relations, this, the protection of flora, fauna, everything, the wing crawling, everything. So these pictures are all from my community, if you're interested. Yeah, these are all my photos. Yeah, so this is the framework. And you can see on the top is when I talk to elders, I use a lot of ground truthing, because you have to be accurate in the spaces and places that you talk about. And the use of Indigenous names is really important, because the use of Indigenous names tells you the history of the land, the original condition of the land or the waters, whatever it is. So, and from there we can start developing the indicators of change. This is not. Indigenous science is about the Anishinaabe laws of stewardship, which is the natural law, the creation law, traditional law, and language law. And these are all important for stewardship. And I'm going to be defining them in the next slide. But the bottom left slide shows the water and the fish. These are our relations. And if we speak for the fish, they're telling us that something is wrong with the waters, and the waters too. And the indicators too that something is wrong with our relations, like for example, water, like a change, the change in watercolor, like the way plus you talk about Western. So the change in watercolor is an indicator, the temperature of the water and what's in the water. And Western science, this is my research. This was around Lake St. Martin area that I did the research, monitoring, etc. And these are really important when we talk about the framework 3. It's saying the Western science can be the various disciplines that we're familiar with, for example, biology, etc., chemistry. It could be engineering, because they are Western sciences. So,
and it sounds like there's Indigenous science has values built more directly into it, where maybe Western science is somewhat, say, agnostic to the values part. It just sort of, it's like very direct. This is the data. This is what tells us. But am I hearing Indigenous science builds the values right in directly?
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to skip over this one. For example, natural law. We're talking about Indigenous science. Natural law is about the way the ecosystem is, the ecosystem, or else the way the system was. I would talk about system. There are systems, the ecosystem. The way it was before the waters are diverted, for example, before dams are built, before there's contamination into the waters, like from seepage from sewers, cities diverting their waste into the rivers. Before that, That's what the natural law is before contamination. And language law is really important because language law links with natural law. It's a language law that is part of the driver. Like, for example, when you understand Anishinaabe fluently, like me, you'll start to understand the roots of these spaces and places that have indigenous names. For example, Saskatchewan is a really good example. Saskatchewan is the anglicized word for Saskatchewan, which means where the water drains. And that name was given before the boundaries of Saskatchewan. And that's an example of looking how the landscapes change, because if you think of Saskatchewan, it's very flat. There's a certain part of Saskatchewan that has very high mineral contents, like there's salt fields, potassium, different minerals. So when you look at the landscape, the indigenous peoples knew the landscape and knew about the landscape, and from there you can start talking to people, identifying using both of the sciences, Indigenous and Western science, and start identifying what are the indicators of a change over time.
Mm-hmm. So when you're weaving those together, the Western and Indigenous, are you looking for, you have your Western science indicators, so you're looking for maybe specific things, and then what type of indicators would come from the Indigenous part of the weave in that example?
Yeah. So, like for example, the Indigenous name would be the baseline data, right? The Indigenous name, Saskatchewan. What Saskatchewan meant at that time when it was named, how it was named, why it was named. So when you start to identify what the changes were over time, you start to understand how these changes, and you start to track what are the changes in the soil, what are the changes in, like for example, trees. Were there trees there before? And identifying what the salinity is of the soil, etc. Like there's different things you monitor.
Yeah, and I think maybe we'll get to this later in your presentation, but I'm really curious to hear how, if you have suggestions on once you get this information, how do we use it, right? But yeah.
So creation law refers to everything, like the whole earth, everything. I include the celestial bodies, stars, because that's important too, because indigenous people used stars for navigation before, like, and those are very important. Those are part of the systems. Traditional law refers to the traditional teachings, and this is where it's really important too, because being an Anishinaabe speaker, a lot of the words that were taught, like I don't like to use a word, that were part of my my upbringing is a better word, because I'm not taught, like I wasn't told that to sit down. I'm going to teach you today what are the meaning of
more
life.
Like
it's not like that.
Mixed into your life,
it's part
right?
of everyday life. So the teachings, for example, we have teachings that are closely resemble ethics, what we call ethics, but they're not ethics. They're part of life, our life, everyday life, the way we treat what is around us. We have words that are instilled in us. For example, myself, Jene means that was a word that was spoken to me not to harm anything, suffer the consequences. It's kind of like karma, but not karma.
Yeah, but more direct, more in the
More,
world.
yeah, it speaks to you. And that's what guided my behavior. Patawa, it's not about you, but it's for the others. Others will suffer from what you do. Yeah, that's what patawa. Yeah. And the 7 teachings as well, we're taught to respect, love, everything. Yeah, those are part of that. And as well too, part of the teachings is to look after what's here for the next 7 generations. That's really important. Yeah, preserving, and it's all about conservation, preservation, yeah, the protection, everything. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think in a lot of ways that's a shared value with,
Yeah.
you know, at least in, you know, Environment and Climate Change Canada, that preserving for the future and understanding it's not just for us, and it's you know, it's bigger than that. It's more important than that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So. And yeah, it's about relational too. It's relational because part of the 3-8 thing is our relations, the relationship we have with everything. That's our, so Indigenous science is the natural law, and when we start altering the ecosystem, the waters, we damage the water. We damage the lands, and what's in the lands, what's living on the lands. Like this is a picture of my community of Lake St. Martin. This was taken in 2011, and after about 60 years of flooding. There's a lot more story behind this, but I'm not going to go into detail. And the upper left is an outlet channel that was constructed to divert the waters, the flooded waters. And the bottom picture is a picture of the Fairford Dam. It's just a little water control structure situated to the west of Lake St. Martin. And this little water control structure has done so much damage to the lands of Lake St. Martin. And this is just a comparison of Indigenous science, well, Western science. I'm not going to go into detail that a lot of people know the basics, so I'm not going into detail. But the difference, I think, is Indigenous science is more holistic and Western science is more siloed. And I think that's where we need to work more together, because Western science, I don't think Western science can learn from Indigenous science if they start including Indigenous science in the work that they do, because the sciences are the same, different concepts, but there's the same. When I talk about bridging and weaving, the Indigenous Science Division is about bridging, braiding, and weaving. And maybe I can go into that a little bit here. The bridging and braiding, when I talk about the first responders, right, they're the ones that know what's happening on the land, if there's something abnormal, observations, and including if something tastes a little off, what they see. So that's a breeding concept. So with the Indigenous Science Division, there's the bridging, where when you build a bridge, for example, you build a bridge to connect, right? Like a bridge over a river, and you connect the two lands, whatever. Yeah, it's a connection. So that's the same with Indigenous science and Western science. You're bridging. I know you want to ask something.
Yeah, no, I'm just sitting here thinking and looking at your last slide and thinking about, you talking about, you know, I saw on there siloing under Western science, and you're talking about bridging the two. And, like I'm trained, I'm a scientist, I'm an engineer, and, I'm extremely passionate about science. But especially talking to you, one thing that becomes apparent is science, Western science has a limitation that it's so, you can focus on minutia and you get, almost perfect understanding if you work hard enough. But in environmental systems, they're so complex. And there's so many things in the water and there's so many things in the air. Just, imagine trying to predict the weather more than a couple weeks out and you end up failing because the system is too complex. And when you talk, and I hear you talking about the land, the connection to the land, being on the land, the first responders and seeing it, I hear this opportunity to bridge from Indigenous science to where I am. And there's, there's all this extra knowledge that maybe looks at the whole system, which is, so fascinating and potentially, a really useful perspective to bring in because, like my specific area of research when I did my doctorate, it's one very little thing, right? And I got very good at it. But, if you asked me how does that connect to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, maybe I'll answer once or twice, but eventually I'll fall apart. But it sounds like Indigenous science, I start bottom up and you come top down the whole picture. It's not even a question. You really were getting me thinking is all.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the difference. Indigenous science is holistic because it's about everything. It's not just one. But like I said, when I described flooding, what happens when it floods, it's not just about water. It's about the species that are affected, the ones that live in the holes in the ground, the fish, everything, the birds that used to have habitat there. Yeah, everything is affected.
Yeah, and there's so much that goes into that if you wanted to study it with Western science, you would need so many different people and disciplines. But if you just see the whole picture, and I'm fascinated to hear as you keep going through your presentation to hear about how to maybe do that weaving or who do that bridging, because I'm thinking to myself, how do I use this? How do I incorporate this into what I do or my practice? And
yeah, so I think the key is bridging, because that's where like I said, bridging, you have to build that connection, whatever form it is. You have to build that bridge, that connection to connect the two together. And Indigenous people, Indigenous science is about being the voice for those that are impacted, was being the voice for our relations. And that's where it's really important. And Indigenous science is, like I gave you an example, the teachings. It's not about, when I say teachings, we're not told to sit down. Today I'm going to teach you, like I said, it's not about that. It's about every day. It's about life. And that's where the difference is that it's about the land every day. What's the weather like? For example, I always talk about this. My mother talks about the way the sun sets, and from there she shares what the weather is going to be like the next few days, the next week, just by the color of the sunset and the width of like the color, the intensity of the certain colors, and that's a part of the knowledge. And which, like leaves, which direction the wind blows, the way it sounds, everything, the way the birds sound when it's when something is going to happen, they sense, because they know when changes are happening, like within the weather. For example, the species too, they have mates. They mate for life. We think they don't have emotions, but they have emotions, and they suffer the heartbreak when they lose their mates. And we don't think anything of that, but they, when we inflict pain on them, they suffer the pain.
Yeah, and I'm thinking now, you talk about that heartbreak and being removed. I'm thinking about your path in your career coming from, this such community-based science, Indigenous science, and coming from that, and then, I suppose being courageous enough to pull yourself out of that, come in the government where it's large, it's structured, and now go and become a professor, a Canada Research Chair, where also it's very structured. And what is that like, trying to take something that's community-based and fit it somehow into these bigger systems, academia, government, that is really not community-based? What's that process like for you in that part of the work?
Yeah, it's very challenging at times because it's about breaking down barriers, breaking down doors, breaking through, shattering these glasses that are out there, like breaking through them, and changing people. Like, I feel like if I'm always constantly explaining, and I guess that's part of the challenge. That's part of the work I do. Like, even the terms that people are so familiar with, changing terms, because words are so powerful. Words, I'll go a little bit into words. Language, my language. The language that I speak is Anishinaabe Mwin. Even the word Anishinaabe, it means, Nabe means man, but we don't separate. We don't have any pronouns in my language. That we don't say he, she, we, they, like her. Nabe is man, but we don't think of it as man. It's hard to explain, not like the English language. Nish is of the ground, Anishinaabe. And the sound that I make when I speak is my tongue, denaneu. Denaneu, that's where my words form. De, heart. So you probably heard the saying, words can break your heart.
Mm-hmm.
Like, be careful what you say. You can hurt other people's with your tongue. Well, that's, we knew that way before because of the association, the body is part of the ecosystem. It's part of our teachings with the way we interact with land, with our relations. And with that language law, we have directions, north, east, west, south. Are you familiar with? With north, we say Kiwe Tenunk means north in my language. Kiwe means going home. Wabanong, Waban means tomorrow. West, Niga Biwanong, Niga, where it dissolves. So these words are they describe the direction. For example, north, Kiwe Tenong. When I went to Chile the past 3 weeks, I met a researcher there who was doing research on birds that go to Chile to spend winter. They go south for
migration.
Yeah, migration because it's warm there. When it's fall here, it's springtime there. So they go there, fly there, and birds are so amazing. Like, they're so amazing. But anyways, he was doing research with the birds from the Hudson Bay, and he asked me when I talked about where I was from and describing. So birds are a really good example. Like, they travel north, south, Kiwe Tenong. They travel back home in the spring, summer, and they go home. Kiwe means home, to breed, brood, like for the reproduction, more life. Like it's a cycle. And these are words that are so important. Like it's they add to the foundations of our teachings, of our understanding of the cycles, the ecosystems.
Do you think that understanding of words would be a good place for people to start that want to engage more?
Yeah, absolutely. Because my language is one of the first languages in Canada, and English and French are second and third languages. I think Canadians should learn a few Indigenous languages to be forced to learn, like the way we're forced to learn English or French.
I'm curious, have you met and talked to, different nations, different Indigenous cultures? Because it's weird, but the more you learn, you come in this Western culture, and when you usually hear Indigenous peoples or First Peoples, and when you're young, you just imagine this is just one group of people, right? But it's not. It's different nations. And I'm curious, the Indigenous science piece, the importance of words, is that something that you find is common across different nations? Or is that
Yes.
Anishinaabe?
No, it's the same for Indigenous peoples around the world. Like I said, when I was in Chile the past 3 weeks, we got to visit the Indigenous people of Chile, the Mapuche, and we got to visit the various places around Chile. We went to the big island of Chiloé. We went to a remote village in Calma, which is 2,000 meters above sea level, right on the Argentina border. I visited schools. So a lot of, there's a similarity amongst Indigenous people where they name their places too based on the role of the ecosystem, and that's the common thread about Indigenous peoples and their stewardship.
Yeah, and that's fascinating to hear that it's globally, because it almost implies that it's not something that was just culturally in Canada where we are, but maybe it's born of connection with the land.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay, moving along. The work that I do, the methodology, I work with a lot with the knowledge holders, elders, and the people who know the land. The picture on the left is my community again, Lake St. Martin. I did a lot of work here, and this particular area on the map is called the Narrows. Why is it called the Narrows, you figure? Does it look narrow right now?
It does not.
No. It was called the Narrows because it used to be narrow. And when I talk about the way the livelihoods were before, we had a lot of cattle growing up. I grew up with of tasks associated with raising cattle, taking water, taking cattle to water, feeding, etc., haying. So this particular area was, they used to cross the cattle from the north shore, which is this, to the south shore of Lake St. Martin. And that's my mother in the forefront there in the blue T-shirt. And the water used to be shallow. The natural state of it, the natural law was shallow water. That's why it was called Narrows. They used to take their cattle across from one side to the other for summer grazing, and the shallow enough where the cattle don't swept away. They used to cross there by horse and buggy. Like that's where they went for the summers. And it was shallow enough now you can't cross cattle, you can't cross it by horse and buggy. And this is what the spaces and places, naming of the knowledge held by the people who live in the area is so important. If you are an outsider coming there, you would never know that history of that land.
Yeah, and thinking about that change, I'm wondering now, how does Indigenous science look at change over time? Because there's man-made changes to the land, like you showed some of the channels doing water diverting. There's also natural changes to the land that occur over time. There's also, and in the back of my head, I'm thinking, oh wow, climate change is probably going to bring big changes to the land. How does Indigenous science view that change, especially like natural changes that maybe weren't just a channel, but
Yeah, this is why it's important. There's natural changes, like for example, water. Indigenous people know that floods occur naturally, maybe once every 50 years or so, and that's a natural that's a natural process of nature cleansing itself. That's a way to cleanse the land for new growth, regeneration of new life onto the land. But for Western scientists, they think flood. Oh, it's flooding. We have to redirect water. We have to divert. They don't allow the land to naturally look after itself. And this is what we need to start listening to the land rather than making decisions we think are good decisions. A lot of times they're not good decisions. We do more harm than good because we never ask the water what it wants. We never ask the water what it wants. So,
yeah, no, that's so fascinating. That's thinking about, you know, the Indigenous science has a broader look at some of those natural processes and maybe more accepting.
So this again is my background. This was taken on Big Rock. It's called Big Rock because if you go to my community, a lot of it is my community is called Obashkuteyang. Means land of the prairie. But if you go there now, you see the encroachment of trees. It's not prairie anymore. There's a lot of mixed growth. So this is a big rock on the prairie. It's actually a rock. Lake Martin was caused by a meteorite. So this is one of the results of the meteorite. And over time, there's a lot of growth there, and it's ideal for blueberries. And there's all kinds of trees growing there, medicinal trees. During COVID, we used a lot of cedar inside our house to kill anything that was in the air. And I never contracted COVID. I never got sick because we had our own medicines that we took from the land. And the medicines that we have are they're from the land versus the ones you get from the manufactured ones. This is again a picture of Big Rock, and the provinces that control burning, like they don't allow fires, and this leads to old growth accumulating, which makes it like during a dry season, the old growth accumulates years and years and years. And if there's a lightning or an accidental spark that goes on land and then it goes up in flames. So this was a Big Rock where I was talking with the elders. They shared stories with me before the controlled burning by provinces, where they used to pick tubs and tubs and tubs of blueberries. And for the last 50 years or so, there was not any blueberries growing on there. And then a few years ago, a fire, well, natural fire caused by lightning, I forget what it was, but a fire went through the area and burned down a lot of the old growth. And for the past couple of years, there's a lot of blueberries. I went picking too, so I know this firsthand. This is, we picked wild blueberries, and this was caused by the burning of the old brush and new vegetation, blueberries coming up because of the natural fire.
Yeah, and it's fascinating to hear that, even though there weren't blueberries there, that you knew there would be at some point
Yeah.
because, yeah.
This is White Shell area. Part of our activities too, we used to go wild rice picking every fall, ever since as far as I can remember. And then we would go in a canoe. I started picking at a very young age. I was a child. Learned as part of my upbringing. So I guess I'll ask you, what do you think is the relationship between wild rice picking and what's the importance of wild rice picking and the ecosystem?
I thinking clearing the land partly. Obviously, you pick it because you need it, but from the land's perspective, maybe clearing the land, maybe you're helping spread seeds, but I don't know. I'm guessing. What is it?
Okay, so we go in canoes, and the water is very shallow. It's not land. It grows in water.
Okay.
Yeah, it grows in water. It doesn't grow on land. So that's one wrong I would give you.
Wow.
So we pick the rice in the fall when it's ready for harvest, and you can see the one on the left side. It's ready for harvest. You can see the rice grains are brown, and when you go into the waters, you go in a canoe, and there's always a person in the front steers the canoe, and the person in the back is the one picking. So it's a process where the rice is high, it goes from the water probably about 6 feet, 8 feet. So you go into those rice fields, I guess you call them. They're in the water, and you go there by canoe and you pick, you hit, pick, hit, pick, hit. And we used to sell that rice. But what happens too is we're helping the rice regenerate because it doesn't all fall into the canoe. A lot of it falls over and it goes back.
Okay, so at least got a little bit right.
You're a little bit right, yeah.
Yeah.
One mark.
Okay.
Yeah. And this activity changed because of there's a lot of mechanical boats now going over the rice, and it's destroying the fields. So, yeah. And do we have time to talk about a little bit about my research? So my research that I'm doing is looking at the Lake Winnipeg watershed and identifying the indigenous names that are used along the watershed. So because indigenous names, they have the original meaning of what the places were named based on their role in the ecosystem by indigenous people.
So is the name almost like if it's telling you what the area was like in the past, so it's like baseline condition?
Yeah, what
sort
it
of
was,
information?
baseline, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's why it's important that the name identifies the baseline condition of the original naming.
Yeah, and then I'm just thinking as someone who was in research is if you know there's a baseline condition and you know there's a change, then you can find opportunities to perform studies, and then maybe am I weaving or am I off base?
You're starting to weave. Like bridging is the bridging will be working with the indigenous people along the way there, working with them. They're going to be telling us what the original names were, and they're going to tell us the way the conditions were before. And we, as Western, will go in there with our tools, little tools and gadgets, identifying sampling, and taking back to labs, and confirming with the indigenous people, back and forth.
Yeah, okay, no, I'm glad you stopped to do that because that helps bring that picture together of how do you put it all together.
Now we're starting to understand.
Yeah. And your question before about if you have time, I think we have about 30 minutes left for however many slides you've got.
Okay, so I think we're about halfway there, but I'm going to go faster now.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. So this is just some of the concepts of three-eyed seeing, our relations, Indigenous science and Western science. I already talked about these, so we'll just go over them. So going back to three-eyed seeing and giving a voice to our relations, there's certain chiefs organizations in Manitoba is challenging Manitoba Hydro and the provincial government over its negligence of Lake Winnipeg. So it's speaking on behalf of Lake Winnipeg, because we have to give Lake Winnipeg a voice. We have to ask Lake Winnipeg, what is it that you want? What is wrong with you? What can we do to help you? And this is what it's about, three-eyed seeing. Giving a voice to the water, asking it what it wants, what it needs help with.
And I love that. Who speaks for the lake?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Lake Winnipeg, if you see Lake Winnipeg, is there a pointer on here? No. Well, anyways, Lake Winnipeg is made up of the North Basin and the South Basin. And then it has a narrow part too where it connects. And Indigenous people, the way they describe the lake, they describe it using the body. So the North Basin and the South Basin are linked by the narrow part, which they call the kidney of the lake. And you know what a kidney does, right?
Yeah, cleans toxins.
Yeah, cleans toxins, and that's the same as that. And if you interfere with that narrowest part, you're basically interfering with the cleansing process of the lake.
Okay.
Yeah. And Lake Winnipeg, the South Basin is really, it's very contaminated. There's days during the summer where you can't swim because there's high algae levels, and just it's very toxic at days, warm.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, because I know Lake Winnipeg is a priority, is how do we bring in some of that Indigenous knowledge where we're not at a good place, but we need to heal.
Yeah. Yeah, so we have to ask the waters, what does the water want? We can't make decisions anymore what we think is right. The water has to tell us what it wants. Mm-hmm. And there's a few other examples around the world where water is given a legal personhood, where it has rights. And being Indigenous people, Indigenous stewards of the lands, Indigenous stewards of our relations, we have to speak up for these waters, for these lands. Some examples, for example, Quebec, Magpie River, the Cree were the ones that initiated that. And the Amazon River, the Wanganui River in New Zealand too. It was the Indigenous peoples and the Maori people who brought the Wanganui River for legal personhood. And this is a really good description at the bottom there of the Magpie River. Ashwosha raven wings echoes in the crisp air. Beaver claws scratch against the rocks on the shoreline. The ice blockade upriver groans and creaks against the rising waters. It's springtime at the Magpie River. Just gives you a sense of the life of the river, how it groans and croaks, the way it's coming to life, like waking up. When you wake up, sometimes you groan and creak, your body adjusting.
Your back hurts.
Yeah, your back hurts. Yeah, that's the same thing as that. Like that description, you can just sense the life of the waters, of the rapids.
Yeah.
This is my community of Lakes and Martin, and if you look at the land, a lot of the tree stands in their area are dead, and the way the elders and knowledge holders describe that is the water table and the ground table is coming up because Lakes and Martin is kind of like a holding tank between Lake Manitoba and Lake Winnipeg. It's connected by two rivers, the Fairford River and the Dauphin River. The Fairford River is from Lake Manitoba going into Lake Martin, then Lake Martin and Dauphin River into Lake Manitoba, Lake Winnipeg. So it's like a holding tank, and the fish as well, they're part of the ecosystem. So the water table, because of the constant flooding from the 60s from the Fairford Dam and Manitoba Hydro on Lake Winnipeg, the water doesn't have anywhere to go, and it's rising. And there's a lot of these stands in the area where they're just dead tree stands. Huh. And this picture on the right is from a fisher on Lake Winnipeg from the algae. And the algae does a lot of damage to the fish. If there's too much algae, we have an Indigenous word for algae, meaning it's part of the ecosystem, but too much of everything destroys. Yeah, it's not good. Yeah. This was an outlet. It's in a previous picture that was constructed to divert the flooding waters on Lake Martin in 2011, and an outlet channel that goes into Lake Winnipeg, and it did a lot of damage. The construction with the groundwater in Dauphin River as well, and trying to remediate the damage that was done caused even more damage.
Yeah.
They're trying to build another outlet channel on the south shore of Lake St. Martin, the extreme south point of Lake St. Martin, where they want to connect a channel from the south shore of Lake St. Martin with Lake Manitoba. And doing that, it's gonna destroy the habitats of our relations, because that's a shallow water along there, and a lot of the birds and the waterfowl go there. That's where they live. That's where they spend their summers. That's where they breed.
Yeah, you've got a question bubbling up in me here. Is the Indigenous science perspective, is it always going to be to keep the land how it is, or are there times where man-made changes or man-made diversions might be positive, or is it always the preference to let the land stay in its more natural state?
The preference is natural, because maybe what are examples of man-made changes that are positive?
Yeah, well, I think the question we make changes to work around ourselves.
Yeah.
Like if there's a city and we put it there, and this happens all the time. People want to live near the water and they build in the flood zone.
Yeah.
And then now you're trying to fix it after the fact, where maybe we just shouldn't have built in the flood zone. And so it's tough, because positive, not positive. I think the people living in the flood zone would probably think it was a positive if you stopped their flooding, but then there's a much bigger picture than that.
Yeah, bigger
so
picture.
It's perspectives,
yeah.
Right?
Who does it work for?
Yeah.
Like if you want to build your house along the river, because that's the ideal place where waterfront properties are expensive.
Yeah.
But when it comes to flood, if your house is flooded, the insurance companies have to pay out. So if there's a flood coming because of climate change, waters, etc., waters are diverted, and then you start building these man-made control structure in order to save these million-dollar cottages, but somewhere along the way someone suffers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or the land changes, and then maybe because it's so complex, you don't know how it's going to change exactly all of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So we're getting to the end of my presentation here. So like I said, the research that I do involves all three lenses: Western lens, and working very closely with elders and knowledge keepers, because they identify where these sites are, where there's trouble spots. And when land is interrupted, when land is destroyed, the land weeps. And when the land is traumatized, it affects us. It's the people who feel that trauma and are traumatized. It's a circle. It's holistic. If you have damaged something, something else is going to be damaged as well. The elders talk about the fish. They know about the fish patterns, the habitats, water flows. They know when water flows are not normal, when water flow, the normal flow of water goes a certain way, when the water flows backward. They know all of these. This is why the Indigenous science is so important, because they know when things happen, when there's a trouble on the land, there are the first responders, and they alert Western scientists, and then they start working together.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, when you talk about, the knowledge of how things were and where the places are, but when I hear about some of the damage that's done to the land, or it's changed, and I also hear that Indigenous science is not in the past, it's new and living. How does Indigenous science handle things? Let's say an area is healing and it's becoming restored, but maybe it doesn't go back to how it was once. Maybe there's a new normal. Like, how does Indigenous science take in new information like that?
Yeah, well, Indigenous science, one thing about Indigenous peoples, they have the ability to adapt. And when changes occur beyond their control, they have that ability to adapt. And it's part of their learning process. It's part of their observations. Life goes on.
Mm-hmm.
But I shouldn't say that, because when something is destroyed, it also destroys livelihoods. It destroys a way of life. Life goes on, maybe in a different direction, put it like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the different direction may be positive or negative.
Yeah. Or both.
Good or
in some
bad.
ways.
Yeah. So this is working with knowledge holders. I combine the oral history, the oral tradition. There's a lot of ground truthing, I said, and I use modern equipment, modern technology. I use a lot of drones, a lot of satellite imagery, and comparing what is said by the knowledge holders to what's out there, comparing. It's always back and forth. And that's it. So I'm both Indigenous scientist and a Western scientist. I combine both knowledge systems.
Yeah, no, it's such a fascinating perspective, and coming out and stepping out of that community setting into the opposite in academia and government, where everything is so big and so rigid. I'm just curious, when you came into government and it was that big structure and you were trying to build the Indigenous Science Division, what do you think the biggest challenges were, or maybe still are, that people should focus on?
There's a lot of challenges. I think a part of it is changing people's mindsets is the biggest challenge, because when we go to school, right from the moment we enter into grade school, we're taught Western way of thinking, of processing information. And that way of thinking is not necessarily part of who we are as Canadians. That way of thinking came from Westerners that came from different parts of the world. They brought their knowledge with them and imposed. And that's how we're trained to think. We are trained a specific way of learning. And I think that's part of the challenge, changing these mindsets, where they came from. And I think it's a part of it is decolonizing these mindsets, because decolonizing goes a long way. It's decolonizing the way we're taught, the way of thinking. It's decolonizing these teachings that were brought on from the first explorers that came to the New World, they call it. It wasn't new. It wasn't new. We were here already. Yeah. My ancestors were here, and it's based on those notes, letters that were written back to their kings and queens. The way they describe my ancestors who lived here, as savages who don't know anything. Meanwhile, we already had our own knowledge, our own indigenous science in place way before Western science was introduced here.
Yeah, well, and I don't envy the challenge that you're coming in, because you're coming into these spaces that have their own ways of thinking. And I know, like, you could probably even hear me talking today, that I try to fit the information you give me into that way of thinking, because that's how I've been trained to think since I was a child, right? And that's quite a challenge that you've taken on, and slowly making progress, hopefully.
Yes, and also if you think of ECCC is probably 80% Western scientists who work there, like yourself. You're a Western trained scientist, and where did you get your education from? In a Western trained institutions where you taught Western science, and you're probably taught that your way of learning is the only way, that it's above Indigenous science. And it's changing these mindsets, changing the terms that are used is part of the challenge.
Yeah, and what would you say to someone who, say, is in my position and does, I'm at Environment Canada, I do scientific work, environmental work, and I listen to this and I say, that's really interesting, maybe I should try to incorporate this, or maybe I should try to, is the start just simply mindset shifting, or is there something tangible you think people could start with and grab onto to begin?
Yeah, I think it's a realization that Western science is not the end all. There's Indigenous science, but slowly, government, even national, international, they're starting to recognize the importance of Indigenous science, and they're starting to include it in a lot of the reports, the policy work that's out there.
Yeah, and it's going to be really interesting to see where the Indigenous science division goes now that you've, I guess, gone back to academia to focus on your research and see, how is this taken in? How is it, utilized? Yeah, and maybe that's, I wonder sometimes is that a challenge, for the top down, because that's usually how change happens in big structures, but that's a Western way of thinking. And if Indigenous science is community-based, I don't know, maybe the way is bottom up. I don't know. I don't know the answers, but I've got a lot to think about after today. And I challenge whoever's listening to, even if there's nothing tangible you can do, just consider it and think about other perspectives and think about how other people are thinking about things, because it's so fundamentally different. Like trying to get myself to think the way you think, I think it's literally a challenge, right? Yeah.
Okay. Oh, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, and so that, I think that concludes our day's event. Thank you so much, Dr. Ballard. This was a really great conversation to me. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope that the people watching us, I hope you've got a chance to enjoy it as well, maybe get something interesting out of it, maybe get some questions out of it, get something, something different about the way you think about things. And your feedback is really important to us. So I'd invite anyone watching to complete the electronic evaluation that you're going to get in the next few days regarding this presentation. And the school has more events to offer. I would encourage you to visit their website, keep yourself up to date, and register for any future learning opportunities that are of interest to you. So again, thank you so much for attending. Thank you so much, Dr. Ballard. This was wonderful, and yeah, have a great day. Thanks.
Miigwech.